Most people assume seven figures is common. It isn't. In a country with one of the largest capital markets in the world, only a small fraction of households actually reach $1 million in liquid retirement assets by the time they stop working. Not home equity, not vehicles, not theoretical net worth on paper. Liquid, deployable capital inside retirement accounts. The number is low enough to force a pause. That tension matters because the cultural narrative suggests otherwise. Headlines normalize seven-figure milestones. Investment dashboards display rounded balances that look closer than they are. Social comparison distorts probability, and over time, perception replaces statistical reality. But capital markets do not reward perception. They reward structure. When you isolate retirement-specific assets, 401s, Ks, traditional IRAs, Roth accounts, the distribution narrows quickly. The median balance across all age groups sits far below what most people imagine. Even among households approaching retirement, the midpoint remains materially beneath the $1 million threshold. And this is where the urgency begins. Because retirement planning is not about theoretical wealth. It is about income durability. It is about converting stored capital into sustainable cash flow without exhausting principal. The difference between aspiration and adequacy is not emotional. It is mathematical. $1 million sounds abundant. In reality, it is a line that relatively few cross. And once you understand how rare it is, the conversation shifts from ambition to structural positioning. The statistical distribution is unambiguous, and only a narrow percentage of households retire with $1 million or more in dedicated retirement accounts. That figure refers strictly to liquid, tax-advantaged portfolios, balances that can actually be drawn down to fund living expenses. When you exclude housing equity and other illiquid assets, the pool compresses sharply. The median retirement balance across all age groups sits at approximately $87,000. That number alone reframes the landscape. It represents the midpoint, meaning half of households hold less. Even among those in their late 50s and early 60s, the phase where balances should be peaking, the median account value is roughly $185,000. On the surface, that may sound substantial, but income conversion is the operative variable. Using a 4% withdrawal framework, a commonly referenced guideline for sustainable portfolio drawdown, $185,000 generates approximately $7,400 annually. Rounded generously, that becomes roughly $8,000 per year. That is not a supplemental lifestyle. That is marginal support. Now contrast that with the $1 million threshold. At the same 4% rate, a $1 million portfolio produces approximately $40,000 annually in structured withdrawals. Layer an average Social Security income, which sits around $24,000 per person per year. A single retiree with a seven-figure portfolio could approach $64,000 in total annual income. A dual-income household could near $88,000 if both partners receive average benefits. Those numbers begin to intersect with national retirement spending patterns, which average around $60,000 per household annually. But the distance between median reality and million-dollar adequacy remains vast. And that distance is where financial fragility lives. Crossing the $1 million threshold is rarely the product of a single extraordinary year. It is the cumulative outcome of ordinary decisions repeated with discipline. Reaching that level of capital inside retirement accounts signals something structural about behavior. It implies consistent contributions across decades, not sporadic participation. It suggests staying invested through drawdowns rather than retreating during volatility. It reflects deferred consumption, capital allocated forward instead of absorbed by present spending. The distinction matters because market returns alone do not explain the outcome. In the early years of accumulation, portfolio growth is contribution-driven, as the majority of the balance comes from earned income redirected into tax-advantaged vehicles. Returns exist, but they are secondary. Progress feels slow. The numbers move incrementally. This is where most participants underestimate the process. Compounding is not immediately visible. It operates quietly in the background while contributions carry the weight. Only later, as balances grow larger, due returns begin to represent a meaningful portion of annual growth. At that stage, the portfolio starts working at a scale comparable to earned income. But reaching that inflection point requires continuity. It requires remaining invested when markets contract. It requires resisting the impulse to interrupt the strategy during uncertainty. It requires viewing retirement capital not as a trading vehicle, but as a structural position. $1 million inside retirement accounts is not merely a financial statistic. It is evidence of sustained exposure, behavioral control, and long-term allocation discipline. And this is where the real signal appears, not in the headline number itself, but in the behavior required to achieve it. Even disciplined behavior does not operate in isolation. It operates inside a cost structure that has been steadily rising. Income levels have expanded over time. Asset prices have appreciated. Nominal account balances look larger than they did a decade ago. But parallel to that expansion has been the persistent escalation of living expenses: housing, healthcare, insurance, food, utilities. Inflation does not announce itself dramatically in a single year. It compounds, and that compounding works against savers. When essential expenses rise faster than surplus income, the margin available for retirement contributions narrows. What appears manageable in nominal terms becomes structurally tighter in real terms. The path towards 7 figures extends. This is the quiet pressure embedded inside the system. A household targeting $1 million must not only contribute consistently, it must outpace the erosion of purchasing power. Every dollar saved today competes with tomorrow's higher baseline cost of living. Every portfolio return must clear an invisible hurdle before it translates into real progress. The challenge is magnified in the later stages of accumulation. As retirement approaches, contribution windows shorten. There is less time to recover from setbacks, and fewer years for compounding to accelerate. But here's what most investors overlook. The difficulty is not simply market volatility, it is structural cost inflation. Even moderate annual increases compounded over decades materially alter the savings requirement needed to sustain a fixed standard of living. The $1 million target is not static. In real purchasing terms, it is moving. And unless income growth, savings rates, and investment returns collectively outpace that drift, the distance between median balances and retirement adequacy continues to widen. Nominal figures create a sense of stability. Real purchasing power determines whether that stability holds. A portfolio valued at $1 million appears definitive. But retirement is not funded in nominal dollars. It is funded in the goods and services those dollars can command over time. The difference between the two is where macro pressure resides. Using a structured 4% withdrawal framework, a 7-figure portfolio generates roughly $40,000 annually. On its own, that figure may not fully sustain a household. Combined with average Social Security income at approximately $24,000 per person per year, the equation becomes more stable. For a single retiree, total annual income could approach $64,000. For a dual benefit household, that number could rise toward $88,000. At first glance, those levels align with average annual retirement spending, which hovers around $60,000 per household. On paper, the balance appears sufficient. But sufficiency is conditional. Spending patterns are not static. Healthcare costs tend to increase with age. Insurance premiums fluctuate. Property taxes adjust. Essential services rarely decline in price. Over a retirement horizon that can span decades, modest annual inflation compounds into material purchasing power erosion. This is the macro pressure embedded beneath the surface. A portfolio withdrawal strategy assumes stability, stable returns, stable costs, stable policy frameworks. Yet the environment rarely offers that combination simultaneously. Real income sustainability depends not just on reaching $1 million, but on maintaining purchasing power across an extended time horizon. And that is where the margin of safety becomes critical. Because while $1 million can support a comfortable retirement under balanced conditions, it does not create immunity from structural cost expansion. The durability of that capital depends on discipline before retirement and stability after it. Stress testing the $1 million threshold requires confronting arithmetic without optimism layered on top. Assume a retiree withdraws 4% annually from a $1 million portfolio. That produces $40,000 in the first year. If markets cooperate and costs remain contained, the framework holds. But retirement does not unfold in a straight line. Annual household spending in retirement averages near $60,000. For a single retiree receiving approximately $24,000 in Social Security benefits, the combined total of portfolio withdrawals and government income reaches around $64,000. The margin above average spending is narrow. For a couple receiving two average benefits, the income approaches $88,000, creating a wider buffer. Yet, that buffer assumes both benefits remain intact and spending remains predictable. Now introduce variability. If essential costs rise beyond projected levels, the withdrawal rate effectively increases. Drawing $45,000 instead of $40,000 from the same principal shifts the withdrawal rate from 4% to 4.5%. That incremental adjustment compounds over time, accelerating capital depletion. Longevity extends the pressure. A retirement lasting 25 or 30 years requires the portfolio to withstand extended exposure to market cycles. A sequence of weak early returns, even without catastrophic losses, can strain sustainability when withdrawals are ongoing. This is not a critique of the million-dollar benchmark. It is an acknowledgement of its sensitivity. The figure offers structural adequacy under balanced conditions. But it is not an excess cushion. It requires disciplined spending, measured withdrawals, and in realistic assumptions about cost trends. In other words, $1 million is sufficient within boundaries. Outside of them, the margin narrows quickly. The distinction between median balances and seven-figure portfolios ultimately comes down to continuity. Reaching $1 million inside retirement accounts is less about extraordinary returns and more about sustained exposure. In the early stages of accumulation, contributions dominate growth. Returns are present, but they are incremental relative to earned income being deposited. Progress feels linear, even slow. This is the phase where participation often falters. When balances are modest, market volatility appears amplified. A downturn erases years of contributions on paper. The temptation to interrupt the process becomes strongest precisely when continuity matters most. Yet the structural shift occurs later. As balances scale, compounding begins to exert measurable force. Annual market returns start contributing sums that rival and eventually exceed annual contributions. At that stage, growth transitions from income-driven to capital-driven. But that inflection point cannot be reached without patience through the earlier phase. A million-dollar portfolio, viewed analytically, represents decades of uninterrupted allocation. It reflects repeated decisions to maintain exposure during uncertainty. It implies resisting consumption impulses that would otherwise divert capital. It signals alignment between income, savings rate, and time horizon. This is the strategic holding behavior embedded within the data. The households that reach seven figures did not necessarily predict markets more accurately, and they remained structurally invested long enough for compounding to become visible. And once compounding becomes visible, the system begins reinforcing itself. The milestone is less about the number and more about the process required to arrive there. A seven-figure retirement portfolio is attainable, but it is statistically uncommon. That contrast defines the broader economic signal. If only a small percentage of households accumulate $1 million or more in liquid retirement accounts, then the median experience is structurally different from the aspirational narrative. The midpoint balance across all ages, roughly $87,000, underscores how far most participants remain from income durability. Even among those nearing retirement, balances around $185,000 translate into annual withdrawals that are modest at best. And the distribution is not random. It reflects savings rates, spending patterns, behavioral consistency, and exposure to compounding over extended timeframes. It also reflects macro friction, rising costs that compete with long-term allocation and shorten the runway for accumulation. A $1 million portfolio combined with Social Security income can support a stable retirement under measured assumptions. It aligns closely with average household spending levels, but it does not represent excess. It requires structural discipline both before and after retirement. It assumes withdrawals remain controlled and purchasing power erosion does not accelerate beyond manageable levels. The broader implication is sober. The financial system allows for long-term capital growth. The mechanisms are accessible. And in that rarity lies the signal. 7. And in that rarity lies the signal. 7 figures is not merely a benchmark, it is a filter. It separates aspiration from structured participation, and it quietly reveals how narrow the path actually is.